So what should we talk about? Let's talk about Robert Parker and the whole notion of Parkerized wines. This is a subject that can be a bit annoying. A lot of misinformation is flying around the internet on blogs and various chat boards and bulletin boards about Parkerized wines. Robert Parker is still the critic in Bordeaux. He really makes or breaks a Bordeaux vintage. He also has a ton of experience tasting wines, starting especially with the 1982 vintage, which at the time it was tasted was looked upon by more than a fair share of critics as not very age-worthy. They were all proven wrong. On the other hand, back in 2003, I interviewed Robert Parker in this magazine, Wine International, and I asked him about a movement that back in the early 90s was, rocking and rolling, was actually starting and at its heyday earlier this decade. And I asked him specifically, what about criticism of the garage wines in Bordeaux, which you like so much, and which are often decried today as being too concentrated? Do you think garage wines have had their heyday, and are they on their way out? And Robert Parker replied, no, I think that they're just beginning, and that this is a revolution that is taking place and will only grow. That was in 2003. Now, obviously, I think if you're watching what's happening in the wine world, there has been a bit of a backlash against the garagistes. And I have no bone against, what's the expression? I have no bone against the garagistes. In fact, I met Jean-Luc Tournevin, who is really the poster boy for the garagiste movement with his Chateau Valandro. In November of 2007, we had a tasting. He even did a blind tasting of a wine that he thought was very modern and a wine that's more traditional. It was a blind tasting, and I picked out the traditional one as my favorite, so at least I was being honest. And he, he also had me taste the Valandro 95, which many people adore, including Parker. I don't know how many points he gave it, but he gave it a lot of points. And quite honestly, I liked it, but it wasn't really exciting me. And what excited me more was a Trotanois 1995. These wines were had both in November of 2007, so 12 years later, which had a lot more life to it, a lot more verve. And this was a wine made from grapes, quite frankly, that were picked earlier, that had a little bit more acidity to them, a little more freshness. And to me, that is what makes Bordeaux special. And if you go back to the 82 vintage, you'll see that a lot of 82 wines are not nearly as high in alcohol as most of the wines made today, which in 82 the wines were averaging about 12.5. Leoville Barton 82 is about 12% alcohol. But now even Leoville Barton, it'll be 13.5. In a very hot vintage, 13.5. It's not inconceivable. And that's fine. There's the global warming effect. People are picking later. That's fine. But I'm just saying is that you can get a little bit too much of anything, even a good thing. So that was the example I was citing with the Trotanois 95 and the Valandro 95. I'd much prefer the Trotanois 95. But let me stop yakking and let me take you to a double vertical of Domaine de Chevalier, which is a really lovely chateau in Pessac-Léognan, Domaine de Chevalier, and Aubailly, another really famous chateau in Pessac-Léognan, in that appellation. And this was a New York Wine Media Guild tasting in January, just last month, in New York. And listen to what Olivier Bernard, who is the owner of Domaine de Chevalier, has to say just about this very subject.
There is always a balance for each wine every year. But we have seen that some people in the winemaking were doing more than the balance, and they were very well paid. So many people understand that. And so they have done more extraction to give more structure to the wine, with more New with more tannin, with more Merlot over wine. Because that was very well paid. And extraction in the last 20 years was very well paid in Bordeaux. And for me, extraction is not a word I like to talk. I like to talk about concentration. Concentration means that the nature gives you the capacity, it's a vintage. But extraction means that the human is going to take the things from the wine. When concentration is natural, extraction is made by human. And extraction has been very well paid in the last 20 years. And I'm not always very happy with that.
Now, you see what I mean? He's talking about wines that push the envelope in terms of extraction in the vat room, getting a lot of color, dark color. Going back to my experience, the Trotanois 95, you could see right through it. The yields were not particularly low, and yet this wine is rocking and rolling. It's going to last a very long time. This next clip is Gabriel Vieillard, who is the winemaker at Opailly, and he's going to tell you about where wine is best enjoyed at the table. And that's something we forget. Many wine critics, many wine tasters, me too, when we're tasting wines blind or even non-blind, but we go through rows of wines in a day, and I've discovered my limit is 50. Some people will taste 100, that's fine, but palate fatigue can set in. Whether it's 50 or 100 or 25, what the natural tendency is when you have a bunch of wines lined up in a tasting, you're going to just pick out at some point the wine that's a little stronger, a little more powerful. And as a critic or as a wine taster, you're going to remind yourself, wait a minute, let's look for nuance too. Let's go back, and you have to go back and taste wines, but often your first impression is the most honest one, right? That's basic 101 wine tasting. But you do want to go back and remind yourself that it's not all about power. But necessarily when you're doing a wine tasting, you're focusing on the wine itself and how it does, much as in a beauty contest. What's the most beautiful wine? What's maybe the biggest wine? Whereas when you're having wine at the table, it's a different context. But for me, that's the context. I mean, I'm not just going to drink a bottle of wine on its own. I mean, as much as I like wine. But, you know, it's nice to have it with food. And so Gabriel, right now in this next clip, will explain the importance of reminding you of that notion as well when it comes to wine and Bordeaux as well.
What is very important, and I appreciate it very much, marry the food and the wine, is that the wine we make it just to be drunk in these conditions. It's not a race. It's not a race of over bodybuilding competitions. And for sure, our very delicate wines, when you compare them in a very long tasting with 100 other wines, the more extracted wine will be over the series. But you serve this wine in the table, the bottle will stay full, and our bottle will be empty, and you will ask for another one. Because you drink, it's very nice, refreshing, it's good to give a good value to the meals, and it's not over everything else.
So that was an interesting clip. I hope it was. I mean, I think it's very telling. And I don't want anyone here to get the impression that this is like I'm being anti-Robert Parker or anti-garagiste. There is no right answer. It ultimately comes down to your personal taste. But I think there's also sort of an informed opinion. And I'd like to think I have one. I've been going to Bordeaux now since 2000. And I just tend to like Bordeaux's that retain more freshness to them. Right now I'm drinking a Grand Prix Lacoste 2003. Now 2003 was a very hot vintage. You might recall that thousands of people died in France because the summer was so hot and intense, particularly older people who didn't have access to immediate aid. They actually died because of the hot weather. And so you also had grapes that suffered on the vine in 2003 because not only did you have hot days, you also had hot nights. And I'm bringing this up because some people are comparing the 2009 vintage to 2003, and that is absolutely false because I was there. I was at the harvest, and I remember distinctly the nights were fresh, so you did have a freshening effect on the grapes in 2009 that you did not have in 2003. Having said that, 2009 will have a tendency to be a warmer vintage. It will not be as classic and, I suspect, as good in the end as 2005, which, I'm talking globally now, will prove to be a better vintage. But again, we haven't tasted these wines yet, so I'm sort of putting the cart before the horse. But I look forward to speaking with you in a future video clip, live from Bordeaux, tasting the 2009 vintage and sharing with you my impressions and what other people are saying as well. So, cheers.